All right, everybody. We are live with our members, a much belated members dialogue, everyone, for April and May. Uh, I have a very special guest, and I want to tell you why I have her on. It's not only because she is Elana Freeland, and she has written, as far as I'm concerned, the encyclopedia, a one-volume encyclopedia of geophysical engineering. She has laid it out extremely well. She has tied together a lot of things that we have discussed in our vid chats over the years, including making the electrical conductivity of the atmosphere, increasing it for all sorts of nefarious purposes. But this book, if you haven't got this book, Under an Ionized Sky, it's at Farrell House, get the book and read it, because I'm with Catherine Austin Fitz here. We cannot talk about climate change or global warming if we don't have a handle on the technologies that are being used to manipulate the weather, manipulate geophysical processes on the Earth, and so on and so forth. So, Elana, welcome to the Giza Death Star. I'm so glad, so glad that you've taken time to join us. I doff my hat to you for doing this book, because it's an eye-opener, folks. Welcome.
Well, thank you. And that's quite a compliment coming from you.
Well,
I've admired you for years and your prolific work.
Well, thank you. I got to tell you, Elana, the other thing that impresses the socks off of me is one of my pet peeves in the alternative research field are people that don't know how to footnote. and you know how to footnote. And I was going through this when I first got this book, and I said, oh, yay, somebody that knows how to footnote. And she puts them at the bottom of the page so you don't have to keep flipping back and forth. I thought, wow, this is my kind of researcher. But I want to get started here, Elana. We were discussing before we started the recording, I'm a latecomer to this whole field, and it was largely your book that got me into all of this. Catherine Fitz recommended it to me, so I went out and bought it just a few months ago. And I want to get started into this by asking you, how did you get into this whole field?
Well, this was, I got back from England. I lived in England for a few years, and I was researching some other books I wrote, Sub Rosa America. It's a series about America since Kennedy's assassination. And one of my files was chemtrails. Another file was HAARP, the High Frequency Active Auroral Research Project. And I moved from England. I came back and moved to Santa Fe, where I had gone to grad school. And I was following the pieces for my Sub Rosa series when I happenstance met with independent scientist Clifford Carnicom. I was introduced by a common friend of ours, and we began to have breakfast every couple of 3 weeks. And Clifford and I would end up with our heads bent over the latest research he was doing, when he was the man of the hour in the late 90s, who was living in northern New Mexico and noticed with the scientist's eye that the jets going overhead in once azure blue skies were leaving an amazingly long trail that even from a distance, he could tell by the chemical signature of the trails were not contrails, were not water vapor. So he was collecting precipitation and detritus in his HEPA filter, and he was analyzing it on a shoestring budget. He used to be a Department of Defense and Bureau of Land Management scientist, but he had quit all that, was on his own, making money by doing IT for people and pursuing his own research along these lines. And he's the one who first discovered the fibers in the detritus of the HEPA filter and began to really seriously look at those. He's the one who established the red wine test, where you clean your mouth out and then you slosh around red wine. and you spit it into a clean jar, and you watch the fibers move. And he realized, he made the connection between what the jets were leaving in their trails and what we were breathing in on a very small scale, micron scale, possibly even submicron. And so he and I had biology in my undergrad days, biology second major. And so I sort of revived that, especially when I looked at my wine test and saw the little guys moving around in the clean jar. And then we went to the microscope for the blood tests, and I saw something sucking the iron out of my red blood cells. So now it definitely had my attention.
Yeah, that will do it. Wow.
And it didn't signify that it was just him and me that had this.
Right.
It signified, we had only about 25 people at that point as a pool of people we had sort of brought in on this, but it signified that we were all breathing it, and that we were now hosts of at least some of which was biological. The rest of it remained to be seen. And that constituted 20 years of his life as he did the research. You can find it at carnicominstitute.org to determine exactly what it was that we were being hit with. And it didn't take long before he realized that this was purposefully done. And the way he did that was he had the ability, sorry about my laptop, I'm sort of ignorant. He had the ability to see who was hitting his site at that time. That was quickly removed. But what he found was over 165 alphabet agencies were hitting his site daily to see what he was coming up with. And this was just a few weeks into his collection of data. So that was my friend. I got very interested in it. Then I moved back to the Pacific Northwest, and he and his wife, ironically, followed very closely on my heels to another state here in the Northwest. And that's when I was contacted by Adam Parfrey at Farrell House. I'd done some editing for Adam when I'd lived in England, and he asked if I thought I could write a book on chemtrails. And I grabbed at the opportunity. I definitely didn't want to do that looking for a publisher thing.
Right.
So, and I knew Adam. I'd already worked with him. We'd already had a couple arguments, so I was okay with that. So I started writing the first book, which was Chemtrails, HAARP, and the Full Spectrum Dominance of Planet Earth. That came out in 2014. Then I was on Coast to Coast, and I was contacted after by hundreds of people, one of whom became very valuable to me, and that was Billy Hayes, known as the HAARP man. But Billy's been beating this path for years, trying to get people to realize what is going on from the military angle, not a global warming angle, not a carbons angle, not a climate change angle, but the military industrial intelligence complex. And so Billy said to me, I know where this is going next. You need to write the next book. So I began to follow the breadcrumbs he left for me in long conversations on Skype that we had. I still have the tapes of those conversations. And I realized that Billy knew, because he was a tower erector. He had crawled up 240 military installations around the world over his career of belonging to the CIA. His father had been CIA, so Billy was CIA. His first job for them was when he was 8 years old. Now Billy is fighting for his life. He has terrible health. He has tumors over his whole body. He's on dialysis. No, the three-letter agency does not take good care of its employees, that's for sure. But I thank Billy profusely in the book, because without him, I don't think that book would exist. He led me far enough that I understood what I was doing. And every time I'd hit a snag of some engineering problem or some microwave problem, I would turn to him and work it out. So I'm so indebted to him. I mean, you know how books are. You're standing on the shoulders of many people.
Right.
When you write a book.
Right. Well, I want to go back to something that you mentioned that already gets us now into the realm of personal experience. In 2014, I lived for a number of years recently out in Southern California. And when you mentioned that you noticed these little things gobbling up your red blood cells and the iron in your red blood cells, all of my life I have suffered with iron poor blood. So I tend to be naturally tired. And I used to have to take this awful tasting medicine when I was a boy. It was like drinking schnapps all the time. It was just horribly sweet. But when I lived in Southern California, I noticed there were days that I was so sleepy. It was almost like I had narcolepsy. I could be sitting and reading or listening to the radio or something, and I would just feel overwhelmingly tired. And it came in phases. And then in 2014, some friends of mine and I were traveling up to San Mateo for that secret space program conference. And Elana, when we came down into Bakersfield, California, I will never forget this because my family used to go out to California when I was a boy. My mother had relatives in Southern California, and we'd always tour around. And I remember the San Joaquin Valley in California, in Southern California, as being this lush, rich, mountain range to mountain range green valley with just unbelievable agriculture. We came down into Bakersfield, and there was this awful brownish gray haze just clinging to the landscape, and we thought it was fog. But when we got down into this, we could smell this awful, acrid, kind of metallic, acidic tasting and smelling stuff. And this gradually dissipated. And then we looked up, and here flying over us is a modified DC-10 of some sort spraying this stuff. We could see it, and that made me a believer. And that's when I, decided to go out and start investigating this stuff. And eventually, Catherine put me onto your book. So I'm wondering, you have mentioned this effect that it can have biologically, and I know that this is the direction you've gone in lately. So let's talk about that, and then we'll come back to the weather and so on. When I read this, and in particular, Chapter 2, when you start talking about Operation Cloverleaf, I read in there that some of the chemical composition, and Elana, I have to tell you, I was sitting in my living room on my rocking chair reading this and underlining it and taking notes. And I read in there the chemical composition of some of this stuff that you put in the book. And I read that it's aluminum oxide, barium, and then the real thing that really grabbed me was chromium, hexavalent chromium. And I'm thinking, this is Erin Brockovich material, that was her whole famous lawsuit out there in California. And they're spraying this stuff into the air, into the atmosphere, and it's getting on our food. It's being inhaled. What are the health consequences of this stuff that we're being confronted with here?
Well, it's bad, as you obviously know. There are several types of things that are coming down. For a long time in the anti-geoengineering movement, we all who were doing this 24/7, working on the big elephant, right? Somebody's working on the leg, somebody's working on the trunk, somebody's working on the tail. We were finding so many ingredients, and were they all coming from the jet fuel was the major question we had in the early years of my entry into this movement. There had already been a phalanx of people in the movement before me. I would say I was wave number 2, maybe wave number 3, the beginning. Was it just from the JP8 fuel? We shifted from JP4 to JP8 fuel. the process of pyrolysis going on in the engine chamber? Was there a supplementary system that was on some of these jets? And we can mention Project Cloverleaf here because it's important that people understand that this was not new with Cloverleaf, but it was Cloverleaf basically brought in the commercial jets as players in this, and all these pilots at that point had to sign the NDAs, and they had to keep their mouths shut. Probably some of the decision making was still going on by the pilots on the airplanes at that time. That would have been in the early 2000s, before my time. But Cloverleaf basically made it so that military and commercial jets were involved in the distribution of these basically nanoparticles. This was the big deal. And when I wrote the chapter on nanotechnology in the Under an Ionized Sky, I was really shocked to see that there had been a law passed in 2002 by the U.S. legislature regarding the nanotech industry, and basically, as usual in America, giving them carte blanche to just see what happens. Go ahead and leave it everywhere. The military, of course, played its role in shoving that through, because just about everything they were depending on for their secret space program was nano-sized. And it certainly had its own chemical signature. They were doing a lot of experimentation. And as far as how much stayed up in the stratosphere, how much fell into the troposphere, they really didn't know in the early days. They were sort of just winging it, literally, and seeing how many of the nanos that they needed to make this stew, this rich ionized atmospheric stew, particularly after they had Bernard Eastland's patent for HAARP. And they were able to zap the ionosphere with HAARP in tremendous ways, and kept telling the public it was over the horizons. It was for over the horizon submarine communications, blah blah blah. But it was really to see how much they could how much they could establish a sort of coupling between the ionosphere and our atmosphere, and basically turn our atmosphere into a mini ionosphere for all the wireless operations that they had in mind for the secret space program. That's what lies behind Cloverleaf. And that's why they brought in the commercial jets, and eventually the pilots had, as I understand it, from various pilots now, mostly European, who have come forward, that the pilots have no say in what is released over what area, because what I have learned is, and I'm going to return to it in the synthetic biology book as a crucial element, is that there is a different mix for various geomagnetic areas, because that's what they're working on now, is correlating the chemical signature with the geomagnetic energy of certain areas for control, C4. Command, control, communications, and cyber warfare. So, everything is about full spectrum dominance. And that means it's a doctrine. It's about controlling everything on Earth. Why? For the sake of the space program. It all goes back to that. It's not just to eliminate populations and eugenics and all that. Yes, they don't care about eliminating. They care about research and data, Everything is about data collection. That's why you and I have nanosensors swimming in us. I mean, they've released trillions and trillions in the upper atmosphere, and we have breathed in trillions ourselves. So all of these things are transceivers. They receive information.
Yes.
Sensors, they then communicate it to sort of fusion centers, NASA places, etc. So that all started with Cloverleaf. I don't know that they call it Cloverleaf anymore. They have all kinds of programs. You know how that goes. But it did begin because they needed a wider swath of delivery. And that was the same time, remember, another delivery system was going on, which was Monsanto.
Yes.
And the GMO foods.
Yes.
This is another delivery system.
Yes.
And then the third and final, which now is getting people riled up finally, because their children are concerned, is the vaccination program.
Yeah.
So those three are my culprits for the synthetic biology book. But I am very interested in magnetism. Because regarding health, the go-to guy that I recommend to people is Tony Pantalaresco, a Canadian whose name I couldn't even say for several radio shows, but I can now even spell it. And Tony has an engineering background and he has Morgellons, and he is doing a lot of experimentation with magnets to pull the nanotech out of us. And this is probably the key to surviving long enough that 5G will not be telling your nanobots in your head, your brain, what to do and what to think. If you can get those nanos out of your system on a daily level with just diet, baths, magnets, we're all scrambling now who know what we're facing. We're scrambling for what works because, of course, everybody is different. Every geomagnetic area is different.
It's different, yes.
And so, we're sort of caught in that impossible place that the American military and the scientists that kiss up to them love to leave us in, which is, we don't have the instruction manual.
Right.
And so we're having to just sort of play it by ear. And they're meanwhile hacking into people's medical records, dental records, everything in order to see what is going on so that they have more and more data.
Well, there's definitely, as far as I'm concerned, a biological aspect to this that I'm so glad you're covering, because it's the one aspect, in my opinion, that gets short shrift. And let me give you an example. I'm in an area of the country that has just been deluged with bad weather, pardon me, in the last week. And the pattern of this weather has been exactly the same on every day that we've suffered it. There's literally a line that seems to be drawn on the map where these storms are not allowed to go over. And prior to this, Elana, I was suffering literally a 2.5 month long sinus problem. I could not. I have a bit of cartilage, a deviated septum in my nose. So my right nostril is usually plugged up, but when my left plugs up, there's something wrong. And it was that way for about 2.5 months. And about 2 weeks before this weather got bad, it all disappeared. And I know that they were doing that. There was stuff in the atmosphere because I have a little dog. I take her outside at night and I have my flashlight, and I could see this particulate stuff in the flashlight beam. And when I finally was able to blow my nose, I mean, it was that bad. I could not even blow my nose. And I hate to be grotesque here, folks, but bear with me. It's to a purpose. There were these plugs that would come out, and it had this prickly stuff in it. I mean, you could feel it. I even, this sounds weird, but I even kept samples of it because it was so odd. It was so out of the ordinary, and it cleared up just about a week prior to these storms hitting us. So I think that there was definitely some weather modification going on with a biological effect. But more importantly, I have a friend, and I'm glad you mentioned Morgellons, because I have a friend that has this stuff. And he literally can be bent over in pain from this stuff.
Yes.
When the electromagnetic radiation is extremely high. And
Yes.
he has sent me pictures of the lesions in that Morgellons causes. And you can see these little, I can't describe them in any other way than plastic fibers growing in these lesions like little antennae. And that goes exactly to what you've said about, people being doped with nanosensors from the sky, from the GMO foods, vaccines, and so on and so forth. So I do think that this is something that's going on. But there's another aspect of this that you've mentioned that I really want to stress. You laid it out in your book that the commercial airlines were kind of drafted into spraying this stuff. And you made a very interesting and important point in the book, and that is that during takeoffs and landings, they turn off the auxiliary fuel tanks, which is where they put this stuff. They only spray this stuff once they get up into cruising altitude. Which I think is very, very interesting, because that's exactly the pattern that we saw, my friends and I, out in California. This was not a plane taking off or landing. This was at altitude, and we could see this crap coming out of the tail end of the jet engines. So the delivery mechanism is there. They've recruited civilian airlines. You make the point in the book that they even have air traffic controllers, shunting flights above or below the spraying level. And, this is a carefully coordinated effort.
Very
but
much so.
I want to get into something now that I know is probably on your mind and a lot of people's minds. And that's the weather modification aspects of this, the geophysical earthquake applications for this stuff, and something that I think is definitely part of this Catherine Fitz calls it disaster capitalism model, and that's the California fires. Because all of these things to me are indicative that they are using this stuff not only for full spectrum dominance, but part of the spectrum that they're trying to dominate is the weather and geophysical processes themselves.
Yes, the weather is primary, and for several reasons. I mean, I honestly don't think there is any natural weather now. Now, natural weather systems do roll off the South Pacific, as they have for many millennia.
Right.
But immediately, Navy ships, radar installations, laser installations, military bases are all alerted. They all know it's coming. And as you know, the jet stream is virtually controlled now. They've been able to bring it down right over Oklahoma. I remember a couple of years ago. So the weather is number one of the 7 operations that Clifford Carnicom detailed years ago as being the 7 operations that are served by this basically chemical, nanotechnology, electromagnetic soup that is highly ionized, and they have to keep it ionized. Now they can get the ionospheric heaters to bump out some more ions from the ionosphere and activate those down here. But primarily it's the weather system and the control over the weather system that will make it so they can use the weather as an energy source itself. And they're experimenting with all kinds of things regarding the weather. I mean, we've been seeing lightning now coming from the earth. It's coming up.
I was just about to mention that, because during these storms where I'm located that we've had in this last week, I watched the lightning strike maps, and they're in clusters, and there are repeated strikes in areas. And this is, lightning striking twice in the same area, but over and over and over again. And as you say, arcing. Well, it stands to reason if you're going to increase the electrical conductivity of the atmosphere, which again, you spent a lot of time at the beginning of your book talking about precisely that point. And I have to doff my hat because that was my thinking as well when I first started investigating this was, well, they're increasing the electrical conductivity. But if you take the view, as I do, that hurricanes and tornadoes in particular are electromagnetic storms in nature rather than, thermal differentials like we were taught in elementary school. If you take the view that they're electromagnetic storms, you can steer these things. You can create them. And in this last round of storms, the thing that I found to be highly unnatural is I had to hit the tornado shelter a couple of times, but I had about 2 minutes warning.
Yeah.
These were pop-up storms. These came out of absolutely nowhere.
Yes.
And to me, this is a signature, absolutely, that this is an engineered phenomenon, especially if you have the same pattern of weather day after day after day being repeated in the same locality.
Yes.
So let me ask you this. Since you've done all this research, do you think it is possible, and I'm to the point that I'm ready to agree with you, that there's no natural weather left? That we're dealing quite literally with people that are engineering this stuff almost on a daily basis, which leads to this question. I have an old saying with my website members: two can play the covert operations game. And right now, sadly, we're dealing with a technology, since we're talking about ionospheric heaters and ionization and so on. There are a very few countries in the world that possess this technology. The United States, China, Japan, Germany, Russia, are the big five that have this technology. I have to wonder if we are, and if you have encountered any data to suggest that we're living through some sort of weather warfare in addition to our own military playing around with this stuff.
I would say that now and then it appears to me, first of all, I don't know how you look at nations, but I personally feel that we would do better in looking at them as from a class situation rather than Russia versus the United States or China versus the United States. I see it as a class thing. And there's a tacit agreement among particularly esoteric elites, that you don't tell if they're doing something.
Right.
You simply deal with it, because it's sort of, there's a sort of sibling, like Cain and Abel sibling rivalry going on among all of these. Now that of course can break down, but it breaks down so seldomly that I don't really, I actually can't think of a time. I think when Iran had a terrible drought a few years ago, things got a little rumbly. We had some beheadings, and there were some messages being sent that it was going too far. And then I noticed that these powers who were working on this backed off. So there's something going on class-wise, if you just keep that in mind. All right, that said, all of the nations that have this technology or are in alliance with nations that have the technology are working on this, because they see the writing on the wall. This is the weapon. This, forget, I mean, when Bruce Cathy, I don't know if you've read Bruce Cathy's books.
I'm familiar with him.
Yes, they're so important. When Bruce Cathy proved beyond the shadow of a doubt with harmonic mathematics that the nuclear bomb was subject to certain geometric requirements of the Earth's position in relation to other planets, all of that, which indicated to him that there were only twice a year that you could blow off an atomic bomb in 2 particular places on the Earth, and that was it. And he said that every nation knew that, and that if you followed the schedule of the atomic submarines, you would see that they would arrive at those places and sort of play, you know, a little bit of a Russian roulette, watching each other during those very crucial times.
Well,
So
I should add here, I know Kathy's thesis. I'm not in full agreement with it. I do believe that bombs can be set off anywhere and at any time. However, I do agree with his thesis because this thesis was pursued in top secret research in the Soviet Union by Dr. Nikolai Kozyrev. And what comes out of that research is the yield of a bomb will vary significantly depending on where on the planet it is set off and the timing that it's set off. I do agree with him on that point.
Yeah, okay. That sounds
I do
good.
agree. Yeah, I do agree with him on that. In fact, I've written about that phenomenon. And I think this is tied directly to what you have said in your book and what the fellow's name that I can't pronounce now has said, that there are differing geomagnetic regions on the Earth.
Yes.
And that they have to tailor their ionospheric experiments to each of these regions very, very carefully. And we're looking, in my opinion, we're looking at the same phenomenon. And it's of interest to me because in certain areas of this country, it seems that these electromagnetic storms like tornadoes and so on are of a magnitude of force that is much stronger in certain areas than it would be in other areas, precisely because of this reason, that they're feeding so much energy into this system. And, you know, I'm in an area that we've just had these horrendous pop-up tornadoes. It's just astonishing how fast they have developed. And normally, you know, back when we had natural tornadoes, if there was such a thing, it seemed that you had a little bit more warning. You could see the green color in the atmosphere with the ionization that always accompanied those storms. Now you can't.
No.
It's, you know, you've lost the ability of all of those early warning signs with all of this stuff that they're putting into the atmosphere.
And don't forget that you are in an area in Oklahoma where you are surrounded by a whole huge army of NEXRADs.
Yes.
And of what are called WSACs, the wet surface air cooling devices, which are basically lots of factory stacks and nuclear stacks. So my question, when I've been watching the flooding going on there, and I've been wondering, see, I believe that they're still experimenting. They're not elementary experiments anymore, like they were the last 2 decades. These are fine-tuning experiments of weather. And in the first book, the 2014 book, I go very extensively into the hurricanes, the tornadoes, the earthquakes. I pick out a few of the biggies at that time that they were experimenting with. I mean, that included Katrina, Sandy, Haiti, all of those, and all the way to Fukushima. And I try to show how HAARP particularly was used, but not just HAARP. HAARP can't do anything alone. It has to always have 1 or 2 other beams joining over the target area. So you know, we've learned by really watching what happens before us as a learning curve, a very sad learning curve, true, but that's usually what our masters leave us with, is what I've noticed in my studies of history. So to just for the weather, let's just look at the weather for a moment. The weather is an electromagnetic occurrence. And it can, like the lightning coming from the Earth now, where they're sending energy from microwave energy from satellite, from ionospheric heater, bouncing off of the ionosphere down into the Earth, and that Earth is becoming a huge magnetic source of energy that can be used. Now let's go to the fires in California.
Yeah.
All right. So now we have something where it's not just weather. I mean, you can't call a fire weather, but you can see that these weather instruments, which are in satellite, they're on the Earth, they're at the space station. There are all these gewgaws that are attached to all of the things that we send into space, including rockets. So all of this is, it can be used for other purposes, not just to make weather, not just to move the weather from one place to another. Okay, so the fire in California was followed assiduously by a videographer named Jamie Lee. Jamie Lee lives, he was at one time a plaintruth.info. Now he's a Plain Truth 2 because he's constantly getting hit by Facebook. But Jamie lives right in Santa Rosa, lives right there, along with another person who has talked extensively and also visited Paradise, California, Deborah Tavares. So between the two of them, two eyewitnesses that I have been in touch with so that I could follow what they were seeing, and I could, of course, see all of Jamie's incredibly prolific YouTubes, I realized how the fire worked there. And the thing that, you know, you'd hear the story, you'd see the video clip, you'd see the blue column, the pale blue smoky column in the sky looking like it's a laser coming down from a satellite, but you wouldn't know if it was a laser or not. You know, there's a lot of, I mean, when you do work like this, which is basically inductive, it's not deductive at all, it's inductive, you're watching, and really what you need is a sort of mind like mine, which is, I have a very open mind, and I don't make decisions easily. I'm looking for patterns, is what I'm looking for. I'm not looking for an authority figure or a whistleblower to come out and tell me what is. I'm watching data and seeing what the data is saying. And sometimes that can be months that I'll just sort of ride along and think about it and think a little more about it. And what really turned me finally was the Paradise fire. I mean, I had watched the Santa Rosa fire. I had watched the Ventura fires. I knew that California was being used for experimentation of a directed energy weapon. That was a no-brainer. I didn't need somebody to tell me that wasn't a forest fire when it was picking out the houses that it wanted to torch. But the Paradise fire, I finally saw something that, you know, I had seen in the Santa Rosa fire, that the trees are still standing, they still have leaves on them, and the houses are torched. I see burning ground. I see that the fire is on the ground, but I don't notice anything particular there. But by the time I'm looking at the footage of the Paradise fire, I'm noticing the embers on the ground are moving in strange patterns. And then I realized that there was no wind. There was no wind. So how were these embers moving? And it seemed like wherever they moved, they would then burn that place to the ground. So I'm wondering, and finally Jamie Lee, in one of his many, he did 100 videos on Paradise, in about 90 something or other, or 51 it was, video 51, he interviews a scientist who is insisting upon remaining anonymous, probably because he wants to stay alive, something silly like that. And he says that if you really look at, he says a few things. He talks about LIDAR, which is light radar. And he says that blue column coming from the sky was probably the LEDs that triggered the fire being able to be formed by the Internet of Things around the area. That would include the smart meter, that would include the wiring in the houses, that would include anything else. He said that was probably a trigger. But the really interesting thing is, he said, if you look at those embers on the ground, those are nanoparticles.
Yes.
And they are programmed.
Yes.
And they are being moved by some guy on a laptop somewhere.
Yeah.
They're being moved to where the burning will happen next. So I suddenly realized that I would have to go back into Judy Wood's Where Did the Towers Go? Fantastic book. I would have to go and look at Judy's pictures again and read a bit in order to see if the nanoparticles were doing that in 2001, or if they have been their programming has happened since then in the last 20 years. So that was, to me, I had, regarding the Santa Rosa Ventura fires, I had been asked by a woman in Portugal to send as much data as I could. And I told Jamie that, and he and I put together a huge amount of stuff that took 22 pages to send to her. But she said that the fire, that this is really strange. The fire in Portugal, and I forget the name of the little town that it was near, but that fire happened exactly as the Santa Rosa fire was happening, to the day. And that the government of Portugal had ordered an investigation of that fire because it simply did not fit that it was natural. So what did that mean to me? Well, okay, that means that someone from our neck of the woods had an agent in Portugal who was able to maybe set a few things up, but that probably satellite would have done the majority there, and that had happened without the permission of the Portuguese government, possibly. Even though I know all NATO countries are part and parcel of this program of the weather control. So anyway, that worked out. That investigation, by the way, is still going on. It does not appear to be a cover-up. It appears to be an actual investigation, but there's a lot of lying going on, it appears. And this lovely activist woman has done a great deal of work in Portugal to bring the Portuguese up to speed on how fires are not necessarily natural anymore. And, and this has to do with people owning property, owning homes. It has to do with the UN 2030 programs that are coming into communities. All of this is another aspect of this, and I would put it under planetary change. Of the 7 categories I have in my head, I would put it under planetary change. They want some people out, just like they did with Katrina. They wanted people out of the zone of down there in Louisiana, get the pour out so that we can rebuild our port the way we want it. Same thing at the port of New Jersey and New York with Sandy. Same thing. Get the pour out, redo the port, international port. I mean, they're basically building around us. And moving, shunting us to the side as they see fit. In order to bring the future in.
Disaster capitalism. And I'm so glad that you mentioned this about the Paradise Fire, that it's a combination, because when that fire happened, one of the first things I thought of, well, they're using the electrical circuitry itself as part of this system. They're using it in conjunction with programming of satellites and the nanoparticle business and the embers. That's an aspect of this that I did not know. So I'm very grateful that you've mentioned this, because if you put it all together, you're looking at a very complex, highly engineered system that they can literally direct and target specific homes.
That's right.
And this, this is an ultimate weapon, as you said before, because they can literally eradicate entire regions, or they can target very specific, tiny, comparatively tiny regions in an area that they want to get rid of people. Well, so it's disaster capitalism, writ large.
And let's not forget that besides the tiny areas they could target, we have the nanos in us.
Right.
And now I think this is all has to do with the brouhaha over 5G.
Yes.
Personally, I choose to believe someone who is somewhat knowledgeable, whose name I won't mention, who said to me in a phone conversation that, well, you know that they have the phased array antennas that 5G depends upon in the 4G model, don't you?
Yep. Yep.
Well, I didn't know that. I did not know
true.
that.
Yep.
But it makes sense that they would, because 5G has gotten such a bad rap. Who's going to buy those phones? I mean, only the idiot population and the young who don't know any better and are thinking along a certain line and don't realize yet that they're not going to have time of correction for themselves the way we used to, where you could go the wrong way and then spend a few years correcting. This is all state of the art disaster capitalism on the move, and it looks like, you know, Mr. Trump is going right along with it with the narcissist businessman who, you know, can't think beyond making a buck. But anyway, it's important to understand that the 5G, it is a phased array antenna setup as well, which means it has steering capacity and targeting capacity. So when this is in one's area, how will we know? Well, I think we will know by the strange thoughts in our heads, the strange moods that suddenly overwhelm us, the emotional scenes and scenarios that take place that seem completely out of joint. That we're going to have to become very good observers. And that's why, you know, what I'm doing, Joseph, is recommending to people to become really interested. I don't care if they didn't like science in high school. That doesn't matter to me. It's a matter of finding out about this technology so that you can protect yourself and your family. That's it.
Well, I'm so glad you mentioned that too, because there is an aspect in all of this technology of mind manipulation possibilities that literally the sky is the limit. And I think this is a part of the plan. We're looking at a country that's in some sort of grip of insanity. And, you know, everybody's thinking, well, these people have lost their minds. Well, what if they're being programmed? You know, this is the problem that no one is addressing. And if you're absorbing all of this nanotechnology, all of these nano sensors, which, as you've pointed out, and I hope people really latch onto this goes all the way back to Eric Drexler and his book Engines of Creation in the late 1980s, that this stuff is programmable. It can be literally programmed to target an area in your body. It can be programmed to target specific, you know, houses, as you've mentioned. And what this means for people who you know, if we're going to crawl way out onto the end of the twig of speculation here, what it means is that they can program your moods. They can interfere with your decision-making processes, with your emotions. But more importantly, if they decide they want to get rid of you, you know, zap you with enough phased array beam interferometry, and you can literally create, you know, spontaneous human combustion with this stuff. You know, science is making all of these old legends a reality, and that's what's disturbing about this.
And yes, and I want to add there that I didn't quite emphasize it enough. You mentioned your friend with Morgellons and how from the lesions are coming these wires that are all color coded. They all have to do with certain functions that are programmed into them, but they're mimicking, they're shape-shifting. They have the ability to reproduce. They are a swarm mentality, and this is the important part about from the fires in Paradise, where the swarm of nanos moved in the direction that one of the laptop boys was directing him to. This swarm mentality is in us. This is how nanos are, and I make that clear, but don't emphasize it nearly as much as I want to in the Under an Ionized Sky. And I will take it up in the synthetic biology book. The swarm mentality is what we're facing. And I want to say to people that the thing about nanotechnology that is quite interesting, it leads us back to Feynman's famous quote, if you aren't deeply disturbed by quantum mechanics, then you haven't understood it.
Yeah.
So now in the tiny world, the submicron world, the nano world, we're in a realm now that that is basically quantum, or it's on the very verge of quantum. And now we're encountering a swarm mentality.
Yes.
That is very different from, like, say, a herd of horses that follows the lead. No, this is a very conscious swarm. It has a consciousness that makes it do things. And so for the programming of that, it is a piece of cake. So with this programmable nanotech that has been released into the world, it is not of this world. I don't know how to say this. Yes,
no,
it uses.
I am fully on board with you here, and the reason why, and I hope people, and forgive me for interrupting you, but I want to dwell on this point that you're making, because this is a supremely important point, because we have discussed many times, Elana, in our members' vid chats on my website, we have discussed many times the relationship between quantum mechanics and consciousness. Yeah. It is vital that people understand that quantum mechanics is a statistical science. In other words, there's your swarm right there. You cannot describe mathematically the behavior of quantum entities without an understanding that it is all statistical, and it's observer based.
Yeah, so probabilities.
Probabilities. Exactly. So it is no surprise that in creating this technology, that they have bumped up square against this aspect of things. They've created a technology, as you say, and I think you're dead on here, with kind of a life of its own.
Yes.
And that's dangerous, because one of the things, and I'm going way back again to Eric Drexler and his book Engines of Creation, the book that kind of brought nanotechnology out into the public eye, for the first time when he wrote that book. And it's decades ago now. But one of the things he pointed out was the gray goo scenario, that this stuff has a kind of swarm hive mentality, and it will start to behave on its own. And that's disturbing, because ultimately it means whoever is behind that laptop steering those embers, he may not be in complete control of it. That's the problem here.
That's right.
I'm so glad you've brought that out, because people really have not, I don't think, grasped the dangers of this nanotechnology.
Right.
It literally can take you over. And the other thing that since we're talking about Morgellons in this respect, Elana, one of the things that my friend who suffers from this so-called non-existent disease, one of the things that he has mentioned constantly to me is that when he is having a bad day with this stuff, he says, it feels like I've got a swarm of ants crawling under my skin. And it's his own word, the swarm, that something is active in him that's not him.
Yes.
And, this stuff is very, very bad, people. And, that's, I picked this area of the country, more or less to get away from the spraying that was going on out in California. It was just unbelievable. And I've still been suffering with this stuff, but not nearly to the extent that I was. But it's so bad. Now I want to shift gears here, because there's another aspect of what you cover in your book that, and again, folks, if you don't have the book, you've got to get this book, Under an Ionized Sky. Like I said, this is a 1-volume encyclopedia of all of this geophysical engineering technology. It's just unbelievably thorough. But one of the things you point out in the book, and this really grabbed me, because again, we've been talking about this idea on my website. I've talked about it in some of my books, and that's the idea that this whole, let's put it this way, this whole weaponization of the planet and of its geophysical systems in this mad quest for world domination that these people seem to have, this whole weaponization of the planet, you point out something that I thought, am I the only one out there that gets this? And there it is in your book. So again, I'm doffing my hat here that you brought this out and talked about it. You point out that with this technology, it is possible to set up and achieve, through resonance effects, to achieve manipulations of the sun itself. So that's a heart stopper, folks. I want you to talk a bit about that and why you came onto that aspect of all of this, because again, I think this is a crucial point that people have to understand. These people are not limiting themselves to this planet. They're going after the big prize.
They are. And the domination of this planet depends upon, yes, population control, full spectrum dominance, all of that. But regarding our relationship with the sun, I mean, Tesla is the one who pointed in that direction.
Right.
He actually said that we could harness the energy of the sun here on Earth. Okay, so whether or not that's fully understood by the astrophysicists and plasma physicists yet, I don't know. But I know that they are doing a lot of experiments with two things that have to do with our relationship with the sun during this so-called solar minimum. Okay, so they're doing experiments with Birkeland currents.
Yep.
And they're doing with Alfvén waves.
Okay, and explain those for people that don't know what they are. Birkeland currents and Alfvén waves.
Well, when you read, and I don't think I was that clear or knowledgeable when I wrote the first book, but when you read there my descriptions of Bernard Eastland's patent, 1987 patent for HAARP, he talks about how these magnetic lines of force between the ionosphere and the sun are crucial to understanding the energy transference that is going on. So the Birkeland currents are very much magnetic lines of force.
Right.
And they are now being created in our ionized atmosphere as they explore how to control the Birkeland currents. And the go-to guy for that is my good friend, nuclear scientist friend, Christopher Fontenot. And Chris has a site on Facebook. He used to have it on just the regular internet, but it was too much work. But it's called A Microwaved Planet. And Chris is always talking about the Birkeland currents and the Alfvén waves. And so if you can go to the expert himself, and it's mainly the Birkeland currents that would give us power over the sun. So every time I listen to Suspicious Observers, which is Ben Davidson, whom I do not trust, I'll just put it out there. Ben is very good at pointing out how the solar minimum, how the space weather is influenced by the solar minimum.
Right.
Now that solar minimum, all I want to do is bring in a footnote there that solar minimum can be used and exploited for a variety of purposes that are going unnamed by Suspicious Observers. That's all I want. I just want it as part of the dialogue that because the Birkeland currents are so powerful in connecting us with the sun, can't you see that the solar minimum could be exploited for purposes. Yeah,
Well,
that's all I want.
Let's go deeper. If we go back to the ionospheric heaters, in effect, particularly if you look at Eastland's patents, where he comes right out and says what we're going to be doing is we're going to be manipulating these currents, and as you put it, and I think you're dead on the nail here, they can actually create currents.
Yes.
With these things. Well, that means, in effect, folks, if you're following what she's saying, that means, in effect, that by creating these currents, they're setting up resonance effects with the sun. And if they set up resonance effects, they might be responsible for the solar minimums.
Yes.
In other words, they're not simply exploiting it, they're creating it, and then they're exploiting it.
Yes.
So in other words, this is a, we're back to the secret space program here, and I do want to get to the space fence aspect of your research here in a minute. But this is another aspect of this secret space program conference thing that I talked about in San Mateo, folks, and that is that they are demonstrating the capability. Let's go back to the Kardashev scale, where you have Kardashev's 3 classes of civilization. Class 1 civilization is a civilization that requires the energy output of a planet. A class 2 civilization requires the energy output of a star. A class 3 civilization requires the energy output of a galaxy. Well, I have what I call, Elana, the feral corollaries. If you suspect that you are dealing with somebody out there that's a class 2 or class 1 type civilization, a class 3 wouldn't be interested in us. But if you suspect that you're dealing with somebody with that kind of power, what do? Well, you demonstrate the ability to engineer systems of a planetary or a stellar scale. And this is precisely what we see going on with this manipulation of Birkeland currents in order to study resonance effects on the sun. That's a class 2.
Very good. Very good. Yeah. That's wonderful.
2. Yeah, that's a class 2 corollary that they're demonstrating. Right. So we're right back with Secret Space Program. And this is where I think that your book, again, folks, get the book if you haven't read it, Under an Ionized Sky. It's an encyclopedia of this stuff. This is where I think your book there's so many good highlights in this book. I don't know where to start, but one of them is that you point out that all of this technology, all of this stuff that they are trying to develop is coming more or less out of that whole Reagan era Star Wars Strategic Defense Initiative program.
Right.
And the space fence here, and many people don't even know what this is. So what I want you to do is try to give people kind of an overview of your approach to the space fence idea and what they're really up to.
Okay, so the space fence is a concept that came with the SDI program back in the 80s. And as I've said many times, it went black under Clinton. It was renamed the Ballistic Missile Defense Program, but it really went black because, in the way I feel, the reason is they did not have the ionized atmosphere that they needed in order to really do it all. So they needed to work on that. And then lo and behold, in the late 80s, here comes Bernard Eastland with his patent about altering the ionosphere.
Right.
And so that got going, and now we're back with the space fence. And what you will see on the internet with Lockheed Martin, who, by the way, owns all the patents and runs the space fence.
Oh, you're kidding! I didn't know that.
Yeah, and calls it
Lockheed Martin.
Yeah,
calls all of them.
Yeah, calls it just like Raytheon owned the patents for HARP.
Yeah.
And they're the number 1 and 2 defense contractors of the world.
Wait a minute here. So in other words, this is also a very important point. So in other words, you've got Lockheed Martin that owns the patents on the space fence, and we need to know what it is, but we'll get back to that. They own the patents on the space fence. Raytheon owned the patents on HARP. So in other words, they've parceled out parts of the system to these different corporate. Isn't that convenient?
Well, I don't think that they were I think Lockheed Martin and Raytheon really run everything. I tend to
It's a
think
cartel. Yeah, that's
they're
where I was
they're
going.
like a government
Yeah.
of themselves, and that the military sort of works for them. But anyway,
Yeah.
however that works,
It's an IG Farben of outer space. That's what it
yeah.
is.
So the space fence, if you look at a Lockheed Martin advertisement for it, they have 6-minute videos where they have cool rock and roll and stuff. You'll see that they make it sound like there are only 2 installations that really are following this all the space junk and keeping our satellites safe in space as the eyes turn out to space, and everything, all the junk is being counted. And there's the installation in the Marshall Islands at Kwajalein Atoll,
Right.
and there's the one which I think is probably Alice Springs in Australia. So they say there's only 2. The truth is, this again, I owe this to Billy Hayes. The truth is that all of this infrastructure to which we are now subject, the cell phone towers, the cell phones, the Internet of Things, the NexRads, the wind farms, the fracking wells, the Wasatcs, all of it. And that's basically what the book does, is it spells out how all of this is now, along with the radar installations, along with satellites up in space, this is the space fence. But what makes it the space fence lockdown is that they are all, and this is where the patents come in that Lockheed Martin has classified, they all follow a certain calibration. They all need to be calibrated to work together. Now that in itself requires recalibration and recalibration and recalibration. So what do you need for that? Well, you need an AI system. That's what you need. You've got to have an AI system to run this big baby. And if you want to create fires in California or a drought in Iran, you're going to be able to regionalize and call upon the calibration of all the instruments in the area and along with the satellite. And you're going to be able to move that weather system, boom, like that. So this is the space fence. We live inside it.
Yes.
And when you see those Tesla domes, think our condition. We're living inside of one.
Tesla,
And it is inside of us. And inside the Tesla dome. I mean, it's like the Russian dolls that are inside every single. So this is our condition, and
it's like that science fiction television series a few years ago called Under the Dome.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's exactly what they're doing.
It is.
And you bring up radar, and this is another important point for people to latch on to, because I just wrote a book about Senator Joseph McCarthy, believe it or not, who stumbled on all this way back in the 1950s. One of the things he uncovered, and his hearings were only declassified in 2003. So what does that tell you?
Oh my gosh, yeah.
So he stumbles on all of this, and one of the things that became very clear as I was reading these transcripts, Elana, was that they were way back in the 50s, they were using radar, in my opinion, to look inside of nuclear plasmas and get a picture of what's going on, because that's the first step in the technology tree, as you're outlining in the book. If we're creating electromagnetic storms with different geomagnetic properties in different regions that require special calibration, there you go. Because that calibration is not only being detected by those radars, it can be manipulated and managed by them, because they're looking into that plasma. And if you've got the ability to look into that plasma, you've got the ability to reach in and manipulate it. So this is this is crucial. People have to understand this. The reason that tornadoes in their natural occurrence begin with a green atmosphere. That's the ionization of the atmosphere. That's a plasma, folks. That's a plasma.
That's right. And all the clouds, pretty
Yep.
much all the clouds we see, if you become really astute at observing,
Yes.
especially people who may have seen real clouds when they were children,
Yes.
you will see that these are plasma clouds, because
Yes.
the reason I know that is they're dry.
Yes.
Even the big puffy ones, if you really look at them, they have some darkness in them that wants to fool you to think it might be moisture. It might be a bit of moisture, but on the whole, it's a very dry cloud that you're looking at.
Yep. And the other thing that you've brought out in the book, and I'm glad that you have done this, is that you mentioned the fact that when we were children, you and I probably remember the nice blue skies and the yellow sun.
Yeah.
And what do we have now? We have kind of bluish white, milky white skies and a kind of whitish yellow sun. So they have so messed up the ecosphere of the planet doing all of this stuff. It is not funny. And, I don't know about you, Elana. I'm of the opinion that Mother Nature is no one to play around with. And when she comes roaring back, she's going to come roaring back. This whole thing, this space fence thing, scares the daylights out of me for all the reasons you just outlined, because they're networking all of this together. They have to. And this is the important point that people have to understand. You've mentioned phased array radars and antennas and so on. What they've done, in effect, as far as I can tell, and maybe you'll agree or disagree with this, but if you look at this space fence concept and all of the systems that are built into it, in effect, they have turned all of the antenna on the planet into one gigantic phased array antenna network.
Yes.
That's what they've done.
Yes, so that they can have access.
Yes.
Anywhere, anytime, anyone.
Right.
That's full spectrum dominance.
Yes, exactly. And this stuff, it's important to understand. We've talked about geophysical engineering. We've talked about weather manipulation. We've talked about command, control, communications, cyber warfare, and mind manipulation. In other words, folks, what you're looking at, and again, you bring this out in the book, what you're looking at is a technology that's a unified physics, and therefore this is an extraordinarily flexible technology. It can be used for a variety of applications depending on what they want to accomplish. And that should scare the living daylights out of everybody.
Well, and that's where the transhumanist piece comes in. Is that for a long time, I remember reading a book that Adam Parfrey gave me on transhumanism. I don't think you wrote it. I can't remember. Did you write it?
Transhumanism, a grimoire of alchemical agendas.
That's
my book. Yeah.
All right.
I got to heart. Yep.
I read that book, and I see that the transhumanism. I've always wondered: are they going to drag us into a clinic or a hospital, or how are they going to get all our genetics? And then I now see that it's all going to be done remotely.
Yeah.
It's all going to be done remotely. And it isn't necessarily you and me, the older generation. It's going to be the younger generation, and they've already gotten a very good start on their transhumanism by loving their cell phones, bonding with their cell phones, living in a wireless world that means more to them than any of the past or any of the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, any of the things that dragged us up from the mud and made us think things through as free will beings. They are going to be brought into this swarm mentality for the slave class. While in the 1/10 of 1% or whatever it is, the upper classes, they will be experimenting on themselves for what they like to call immortality. I find that idea of immortality is kind of a jerry-rigged thing. I'm not sure they're going to it's going to be exactly what they think it is.
No, it won't. No, I wrote about that, Elana, in the very first book that I did in this whole alternative field, and I went back.
Oh.
I went back to St. John Chrysostom, who made the observation in the 4th century that the reason that mankind can grow spiritually is because of death. Because if we did not die, we would progress in whatever moral direction that we were on. Think of Mother Teresa living centuries to do all the good, or conversely, think of Joseph Stalin or Adolf Hitler living for hundreds of years to do all the evil. In other words, this immortality thing is being looked at by these people from simply a technological point of view rather than a moral and spiritual one.
Yes.
And frankly, given some of these people and what they write and what they're up to, I don't want to live forever with these people. No way. No way. And I think you're right. They may achieve some sort of physical longevity, but I think the spiritual condition that they're going to be in is going to be one of what we see more or less now. It strikes me that we've got people that are so bored with life that they're just tinkering with all of this stuff just for fun, just for kicks and giggles because they're bored. And this brings, that introduces the condition of anomie and dispassion. And so, they throw over all of their humanity in the name of all of this stuff. And
yeah.
That's not a way to go.
In a way, that's kind of the mood that overtook me when I saw Chartres burning.
Oh, Notre Dame, you mean? Yeah.
Yeah. Notre Dame. Yeah. I just had this mood come upon me of the loss.
Yeah, I did too. And I think it was deliberate. I think it was deliberate. Let's attack some symbol, as you say, of something that helped drag us up out of the muck, and make us free will beings. And I think it was deliberate. And I'm even more horrified at some of the plans, for restoring it, a greenhouse and all of this stuff. These people have no they have no rootedness in anything that's part of the human tradition or human condition. And that's what's so frightening about all of this, because you get that feeling reading your book, what really motivates these people. Is it simply full spectrum dominance? Is that all it is? And I think it goes much deeper. I think it's just this nihilistic quest, to prove that they've achieved some sort of divine status by the fact that they can destroy things. It just boggles my mind that there would be people like this. Anyway, I didn't mean to get off on that tangent, but.
No, it's fine. And it reminds me of years ago when I started a little Waldorf preschool in Seattle. I had all these wonderful boys. I always attract a lot of boys when I teach. I don't know why, but these little guys had these big blocks, and there were lots and lots of them, and they loved to build it up like a Tower of Babel. Up it goes all the way up, higher than they are, and they're getting more and more excited as then they choose among them who gets to destroy the tower, and they shriek with laughter as the destruction comes, and then they rebuild it again, getting very quiet as they rebuild, and the excitement building. And that's when I realized the glee in destroying.
Yeah, there is. And the Tower of Babel, I mentioned this in the Secret Space Program conference, that the way I'm looking at things, Elana, what we're seeing with the development of these technologies is another Tower of Babel moment of history. And that's not my phrase. It's actually Leonard Bernstein's phrase, believe it or not. But But we're at another Tower of Babel moment of history, because if you look at the biblical story, it's different from all those other Old Testament stories. Mankind is sinning, God sees it, comes down and says, don't do that, and, slaps us around a bit. The Tower of Babel story is different, because what it says is if they finish this project, whatever it was, they will be able to do whatsoever they imagine to do. And talk about, you're building a tower that reaches up to heaven. And I've always taken that as a metaphor that what they're really grasping at is they're trying to get a hold of the physics of the cosmos itself, so that they can play God. And that's exactly what we see with this type of technology.
Right.
So, the way I look at it, the national security state was looking at this UFO problem and thought, okay, we're confronted with something that is way beyond what we can do. So we need to avoid another repetition of that moment in history. So we've got to develop that technology ourselves.
Yeah.
And that's what they've done. Right. And that, that should give us pause, because, it could be in trying to avoid that whole thing that we've created the conditions for it. So,
yes.
So, it seems like we're on a treadmill with this stuff. I want to leave here. We've gone already about an hour and a half. This has been a fascinating talk, but I want to and you'll have to pardon me, I'm making more cigarettes here. I smoke to keep my sinuses dry. It's for me.
Really?
Yeah, I do. I roll my own cigarettes.
Oh my gosh.
It helps keep my sinuses dry. And like I say, I've had this deviated septum all my life, so I've got to keep my sinuses dry, or otherwise I don't breathe very well. But the thing I want to ask you, you have been studying this whole development, and I have no problem with calling it a transhumanist development, because that's exactly what I think we're confronted with here with this technology. So if you were to brainstorm or speculate off the top of your head about where all of this is going, what would you advise people like us to do to try and minimize the effects of all of this stuff in our lives? What would be your approach to doing that? Because I know you've thought about it.
Oh, yeah. That's just about all I'm talking about now, actually, after I lay out how the system works and lay out the nanotechnology and wax heavily on the nanotechnology that we have breathed in, imbibed in many ways. I mean, this nanotech is in all the clothes we buy. Everything new you would ever buy will have nanos in it. All the types of foods you buy, prepackaged foods, will probably have nanos in them as fillers. So they don't have to list anything. They don't have to let you know that it's there, so that we have all these nanos. So what I'm recommending to people, I have a variety of things. First of all, the health aspect. I mentioned Tony Pantalaresco, the Canadian, who has 3 or 4 websites loaded with ideas that he is pursuing, that he's explaining. I don't always agree with Tony, such as he thinks organic food is a waste of time. I don't really think that's true. But on the other hand, most of what he says is gained from experience. He's done a great deal. He has a wonderful lab. It looks completely chaotic to me, but you know how it is when it's your lab, you know where everything is. So I'm taking his bath every week. In fact, lately I've been doing it a little more, which is 1 cup of Epsom salt, 1 cup of sea salt, and 1 cup of borax in the bath. And this is a draw. They will come out through the pores of the skin.
Oh, wow.
You probably won't be able to see them unless you have it dark in the bath and you have a flashlight like the one you had when you went outside. You'll be able to see some scum on top of the water. So that he's got a magnet that he shows you how to build so that you can drive them out with a magnetic field of your own making. He has a variety of things he's recommending people to take for nutrients. And then I have my own things. So this is me now. Sleep on a bed that has no wire in it. No wire whatsoever, so that you can avoid the electromagnetic smart meters in the area, cell phones in the area, cell towers in the area, all using your 60 hertz. It's as though you're living in the inverse of a Faraday cage. And so that, sleep with your head to the north or the east. Keep if you have a cell phone, I don't have one, you can, I'd park it in your car outside your house and pick up your messages.
I have to stop you because you said sleep with your head to the east. I have experimented over the years, and that's what I do.
Yeah.
I know it sounds wacky, folks, but it works.
You can feel it.
You can feel it. Yes, you can. Yes,
because we're magnetic beings.
Yes, we are.
Yeah. So the cell phone, okay, that's one. Sleep with your body away from the wall where the 60 hertz is running. Unplug everything you can in your sleeping area and unplug your router and turn it off at night. So all that awareness of the electromagnetics is crucial. As your friend with the Morgellons knows, they love electromagnetics. And you go near anything electromagnetic, like a toaster oven, and the Morgellons will just go nuts. They are programmed for that. So those things are crucial. Examine your lifestyle. What are you doing that you know is not good for you, but you continue doing it anyway? Maybe you want to think about that. How you live. I live very simply. I live almost monk-like because I would like to get as much bang for my buck out of this life as I can. I have a few more things I want to write. That sort of thing, the lifestyle, the sleeping, and the baths, and checking out what other people are finding. If you're a Morgellons sufferer and you don't know you're a Morgellons sufferer, it would be primarily you'd know through the lesions. You would know through feeling the activity under your skin. Do not go to a doctor. They will send you to the psych ward. And they'll put down on your record that you have delusional parasitosis. You really need to, and it could, damage your job, or you could lose your, it's crazy out there. So the Morgellons loves acidity and hates alkalinity. So start looking at your diet. What produces alkalinity? What produces acidity? And balance those things. I eat pretty much a macrobiotic diet, have for about 50 years. It works for me, but everybody's going to find something different that would work for them. And so that's for health. There's another part of this that I wanted to emphasize when we were talking about swarm consciousness. I want to emphasize this. It may sound like we're up against a critter that has tremendous power over us. Well, their consciousness is of another order. This is true. But it seems to me that most human beings have not even begun to tap what their consciousness really is.
Yeah, I
And
agree.
I'm starting a movement. It's pretty small right now, a couple of groups, in which I am trying to show people that if they get together, the old 2 or 3 gathered in my name sort of thing, get together and read Under an Ionized Sky together in a study group every week. Just read as much as you do in an hour and a half, have some refreshments, have some social time, and go home and go to bed. That we can enter a certain frequency of these concepts. I know I'm sounding very Platonist right now, but this is how it works. There is a certain realm where vast, huge ideas are, and the magicians who are running this planet right now have tapped into that. And my hope is that people will begin to experiment with a group consciousness of their own, out of their own free will, through the concepts in my book. The only reason I'm recommending my book is no other book has been written on this yet, but there will be some. I know they are coming. But to read and discuss those concepts so that you can see what it feels like to enter those realms of the concept. And this is so important. I wish I were there with every group to give you the ballast of my own mind, because I have trained myself over many years of how to think. And I don't know what your mind looks like, Joseph. You have an amazing mind, I can tell. But in my mind, when I'm like now in the synthetic biology book, I'm about a third through it. I see a plane before me, a huge, long plane, very, very distant. And there are these concepts that are on this plane. And I know exactly where they are, and I know exactly what they're made of. And I can go from one to the other, and then I can write from that. That's how my mind works. Everybody's mind is different, but unless we can concentrate together, we can't really go very far. And no, I'm not saying we need to meditate together at a certain time of day. I'm not saying we need to pray together. I'm saying we need to learn to think these concepts together, because these are the concepts that have been hoodwinked and stolen from their rightful place by magicians who are using them for black magic.
Yes, I'm in total agreement, and I'll tell you why. And Catherine Fitz put me onto this individual. There's a professor of material science in California by the name of Dr. William Tiller that did a number of experiments that I wrote about in my book, Microcosm and Medium, where he demonstrates the ability of a specified group intention, as you say, where 2 or 3 are gathered together, to modify in a specific way the performance of physical systems, including alkalinity, pH factors, gestation periods of fruit flies, and so on and so forth, simply by an agreed upon intention. And he's performed, and he's performed a number of very breathtaking experiments to demonstrate this. So I agree. We have been captured by a bunch of black magicians, and it's time to start practicing a little reverse magic. Although I have some specific ideas on what that entails, but it is something that we can do, and I think, and again, I'm in foursquare agreement with you. The human consciousness is the battlefield in this war, and it's the prize in the war.
Yes, very much so. And we haven't even begun to tap it. Not even begun.
No, we haven't.
Yeah.
We haven't. Well, I want to thank you, Elana. I know that I've taken up a lot of your time here, but I really do appreciate your being with us and discussing these things. We've been trying to get together, folks, for about 2 weeks, and it finally happened. But I want again to direct everybody to Under an Ionized Sky. This is published by Feral House. If you haven't got this book, like I said before, folks, this is a true encyclopedia of all of this technology and what they're up to with it, how they've gone about it. It's just it's a breathtaking book, Elana, and I wish I had written it.
Because, oh, come on!
Because it's just wonderfully documented. It's just a breathtaking book. And folks, if you don't have it, if you want to know about all of these chemtrails, weather modification, this is the one book to get. So I want to thank you, Elana, deeply for being with us tonight. Thank you very much.
I'm honored to be with you.
Well,
Joseph.
We're honored to have had you, and it's been a lot of fun tossing things around. We'll have you back if you're willing at some point to talk again about things, and let us know when you get the new book out, because we'll definitely have you back for that if you'll do that for us.
Yes,
all right.
I will.
Well, all right. Thank you.
Okay.
So that's it. I'm going to stop the broadcast now.